In June 1942, a secret aircraft fell from the sky over the English countryside. 11 men were on board. None survived. Winston Churchill ordered the crash buried. No newspapers, no announcements. The families were told almost nothing. For nearly 3 years, Britain pretended it never happened. Why? Because one of those men carried a secret worth more than his own life. A secret that would burn German cities to the ground. His name was Alan Blumlein, and you have never heard of him. This is the strange part. Every time you put on headphones as left channel, right channel, you are using his invention. He created stereo sound. He filed the patent in 1931, and the music industry still uses his system today. But that was just his side project. During the war, Blumlein built something far more dangerous. A radar system that could see through clouds, through darkness, through everything. British bombers no longer had to guess where German factories were hiding. They could see them from 20,000 feet in the middle of the night. Hitler never discovered who built this weapon. The secret was kept so well that even today most people walk past his legacy without knowing his name. This is the story of Britain's forgotten genius, a man who could not read until the age of 12. Alan Blumlein was born on the 29th of June, 1903 in Hampstead, London. His background was unusual for a future British hero. His father, Joseph Blumlein, was a German immigrant who had fled to England in 1871 to escape conscription into the Prussian army. His mother, Jessie Edward Dower, was Scottish, born in South Africa to a missionary family. The boy who would one day change the war could not read properly until he was 12 years old. His sister loved to remind him of this. His response became famous among the family. He said that while he could not read, he already knew a great many quadratic equations. For young Alan, numbers made sense in a way that letters simply did not. But here is where the story gets interesting. At the age of 7, Blumlein repaired the broken doorbell in his family home. Then he did something remarkable. He presented his father with a handwritten invoice. It read, Alan Blumlein, electrical engineer. At the bottom he had scrawled one word in pencil, paid. He was 7 years old, and he already knew exactly what he wanted to become. When Blumlein finally arrived at Imperial College London in 1921, something clicked. He won a governor's scholarship that allowed him to skip directly into the second year. Then he did the impossible. He completed the entire 4-year engineering course in just 2 years and graduated with first-class honours. By the age of 25, Alan Blumlein was already filing patents that his own supervisors struggled to understand. The engineering world had never seen anyone quite like him, and he was only getting started. In 1931, Alan Blumlein took his wife Doreen to the cinema. It should have been a pleasant evening. Instead, it made him furious. The problem was deceptively simple. On screen, an actor walked from one side of the frame to the other, left to right, right to left, moving naturally through the scene. But the sound came from a single speaker mounted at the side of the screen. It never moved. The voice stayed fixed in one place while the actor traveled across the entire width of the picture. To most people in the audience, this was normal. They had never known anything different. To Alan Blumlein, it was intolerable. The visual illusion of cinema was extraordinary. Moving pictures that told stories, that captured life itself. But the sound was a lie. It broke the spell. Every time an actor crossed the screen, the disconnect between what the eyes saw and what the ears heard destroyed the sense of reality. Blumlein could not understand why nobody else seemed bothered by this obvious flaw. On the way home that evening, he turned to his wife and said something that would have sounded absurd from anyone else. He told her that he had figured out how to make the sound follow the actor across the screen. Not someday, not theoretically. He had already worked out the solution in his head, right there in the cinema, while everyone else was simply watching the film. Doreen had been married to Alan long enough to know that when he said such things, he meant them. What Blumlein understood, and what no one else had properly grasped, was the science of how human ears locate sound. He knew the research of Lord Rayleigh, who had discovered that humans perceive the direction of sound in two different ways. For low frequencies below about 700 cycles per second, our brains detect tiny differences in timing between our left and right ears. For higher frequencies, we sense differences in volume instead. Any successful stereo system would need to recreate both of these effects simultaneously. On the 14th of December, 1931, Blumlein filed British patent number 394325. The document was titled Improvements in and Relating to Sound Transmission, Sound Recording and Sound Reproducing Systems. It was not a modest proposal. A typical patent of that era contained around 6 individual claims, 6 specific inventions or techniques being protected. Blumlein's patent contained 70. He had not merely invented stereo sound. He had mapped out the entire territory. The patent described a new type of microphone arrangement, 2 microphones positioned at precisely 90 degrees to each other, capturing sound the way human ears do. It described a revolutionary recording technique called the 45-45 system, which cut 2 separate channels into a single groove on a gramophone record. It described electronic circuits for mixing and separating the left and right channels. It described the mathematics of how to convert timing differences into volume differences so that loudspeakers could recreate the original spatial effect. He had thought of everything, every microphone placement, every circuit design, every possible method of encoding and decoding directional sound. In one single patent, filed at the age of 28, Alan Blumlein had defined the future of audio technology for the next century. Between 1933 and 1935, Blumlein created test recordings to prove his system worked. He recorded trains passing through Hayes Station, a demonstration so spatially precise that listeners could hear the locomotive approach from the left, thunder past, and fade into the distance on the right. Audio engineers who heard it decades later called it the most sonically advanced recording of its era. In January 1934, he recorded the London Philharmonic Orchestra, performing Mozart at Abbey Road Studios with Sir Thomas Beecham conducting. It was the first true stereo orchestral recording in history. Years later, when engineers at Decca tried to develop their own stereo system, they made a disturbing discovery. Every conceivable approach they attempted had already been covered in Blumlein's patent. Every microphone technique, every recording method, every playback solution. One man working alone had anticipated everything an entire industry would try to invent over the following 3 decades. But here is where the story turns bitter. EMI, the company that employed Blumlein, examined this revolutionary technology and decided to put it on a shelf. The Great Depression had devastated the global economy. Record sales had collapsed. Families were struggling to afford food, let alone gramophones. Louis Sterling, EMI's marketing director, made a cold calculation. He believed that any improvement in cinema sound could wait until after the introduction of color film, and stereo for home listeners was simply unrealistic. Most people could barely afford 1 loudspeaker. Asking them to buy 2 was commercial madness. The stereo project was shelved. Blumlein moved on to other work. His 45-45 system finally became the worldwide standard for stereo gramophone records in 1958, 27 years after he filed the patent. By then, Alan Blumlein had been gone for 16 years. He never heard a single stereo record played for a paying audience. He never saw headphones with left and right channels become something that billions of people would use every single day. But in 1939, while his stereo invention gathered dust in a filing cabinet, Britain faced a crisis that made cinema sound seem trivial. The country was about to go to war, and Alan Blumlein was about to receive an assignment that would change everything. By 1941, Britain was fighting back. Every night, Royal Air Force bombers crossed the English Channel and headed deep into German territory. The newspapers told stories of devastating raids on factories, railways, and military installations. The British public believed their bomber crews were systematically dismantling the Nazi war machine, one target at a time. It was a lie. The truth was so embarrassing that the government kept it classified. Bomber Command was missing almost everything. The crews were brave, the aircraft were capable, but the bombs were falling into empty fields, into forests, into rivers, anywhere except the targets they were supposed to destroy. In August 1941, a civil servant named David Ben-Susan Butt was asked to conduct an honest analysis. He examined over 600 photographs taken by bomber crews during their raids, images captured at the moment of bomb release, to verify where the weapons actually landed. What he discovered was devastating. The Butt report concluded that only one bomb in 20 was landing within 5 miles of its intended target. Not 500 yards, not 1 mile, 5 miles. And that was the average. On nights with poor visibility or heavy cloud cover, the accuracy dropped to 1 in 15. During raids on the heavily defended Ruhr industrial region, only 1 bomb in 10 came anywhere close to the target. The rest, the vast majority of Britain's bombing effort, was falling on open countryside. Some bombs were landing 50 kilometers from where they were supposed to hit. Entire missions were being flown. Crews were risking their lives. Aircraft were being lost. And the bombs were doing nothing but making holes in German farmland. The problem was navigation. Finding a specific factory or railway junction in the middle of Germany at night from 20,000 feet was nearly impossible. The crews had maps and compasses. They had estimated wind speeds and calculated flight times. But once they crossed into enemy territory, they were essentially blind. Cities looked alike in the darkness. Rivers could be confused with roads. Cloud cover hid everything. Britain had developed radio navigation systems to help solve this problem. The G system used signals from ground stations in England to help bombers calculate their position. The oboe system was even more precise. Ground controllers could track an aircraft and tell the crew exactly when to release their bombs. But both systems had a fatal limitation. They only worked within about 350 kilometers of the English coast. The radio signals traveled in straight lines, which meant they could not follow the curvature of the Earth. Beyond that 350-kilometer range, the bombers were on their own. Targets deep inside Germany, Berlin, Munich, the industrial heartland, were completely beyond the reach of any navigation assistance. And the Germans quickly learned to jam the signals anyway, filling the radio frequencies with noise that made the systems useless. Bomber Command was flying blind. They were sending young men into the darkness to drop bombs on targets they could not see, using navigation tools that stopped working halfway to their destination. The losses were mounting, the results were pitiful, and the British public had no idea. When Winston Churchill read the Butt report, he was furious. Britain was pouring enormous resources into the bombing campaign: aircraft, fuel, trained crews, industrial production, and nearly all of it was being wasted. The Prime Minister demanded a solution. He needed a system that could work independently without any connection to ground stations in England. Something that could function in any weather. through any cloud cover, over any target in Germany. Something that could finally let British bombers see in the dark. The technology Churchill needed did not exist. But two physicists working in a university basement in Birmingham had just created something extraordinary. A device no larger than a human fist that generated more power than any radio transmitter ever built. The Cavity Magnetron was about to change everything. In February 1940, while Alan Blumlein was still working on television systems at EMI, two physicists at the University of Birmingham made a breakthrough that would reshape the entire war. John Randall and Harry Boot created the Cavity Magnetron, a copper device roughly the size of a man's fist that could generate microwave radiation with extraordinary power. If you have seen our previous video about Randall and Boot, you know the full story of how this remarkable invention came to be. If not, here is what matters for understanding what happened next. Radar already existed in 1940. Britain had the chain home system, a network of tall towers along the coastline that could detect incoming German aircraft. But chain home had a fundamental problem. It operated on long radio wavelengths, around 12 meters. And in physics, there is an unbreakable rule. The longer your wavelength, the larger your antenna must be. Chain home worked because its antennas were fixed towers standing over 100 meters tall. You cannot put a 100-meter tower on an aircraft. The existing radar technology was simply too big, too heavy, and too imprecise to fit inside a bomber. The Cavity Magnetron changed everything. It generated microwaves at a wavelength of just 9 centimeters, more than 100 times shorter than chain home. Shorter wavelengths meant smaller antennas. An aircraft could carry a rotating dish just 60 centimeters across and still achieve excellent results. Shorter wavelengths also meant better resolution, the ability to distinguish between objects that were close together. A 9-centimeter radar could see individual buildings, separate rivers from roads, identify the shapes of cities. The magnetron gave Britain the raw power it needed, but power alone was not enough. Think of it this way. The magnetron was the heart, pumping energy into the system, but a heart without a brain is useless. Someone needed to build the brain. Someone needed to design the transmitters that would fire radar pulses toward the ground. Someone needed to create the receivers that would capture the returning echoes. Someone needed to invent the display system that would turn those echoes into a map, a picture of the Earth below, visible on a screen in front of the navigator in total darkness through solid cloud cover. This was not a job for ordinary engineers. The task required someone who understood electronics at the deepest level, someone who could solve problems that had never been solved before, someone whose mind worked faster than anyone else in the room. The task was assigned to a team at EMI, working under contract to the telecommunications research establishment. And the man placed at the technical heart of that team had never built a radar system in his life. His name was Alan Blumlein, and he was about to create a weapon that would burn cities to the ground. The breakthrough came almost by accident. In November 1941, a physicist named Philip D. was testing an experimental radar system designed to detect ships from the air. The equipment was mounted in a Blenheim bomber flying over the English countryside. D. was focused on finding vessels in the water below. But then he noticed something unexpected. Different surfaces on the ground were producing different radar returns. Water reflected the signal weakly. It appeared dark on the screen. Open fields gave a moderate return, but buildings lit up brightly. The vertical walls of structures acted like corner reflectors, bouncing the radar signal straight back to the aircraft with surprising intensity. Cities were glowing on the display like clusters of stars against a dark sky. Dee had not been looking for this. Nobody had been looking for this, but he immediately understood what it meant. If radar could distinguish between water, land, and buildings, then radar could create a map. A navigator would not need to see the ground. He would not need clear skies or moonlight. He could look at a screen and see rivers, coastlines, cities, everything he needed to find his target. On the 1st of January 1942, the Telecommunications Research Establishment formally created a new project team. The mission was to turn Philip Dee's accidental discovery into a working system that could guide Bomber Command to its targets. The team leader was a young physicist named Bernard Lovell, who would later become Sir Bernard Lovell, founder of the famous Jodrell Bank Observatory. EMI received the production contract, and Alan Blumlein became the project's chief technical architect. The system they built was called H2S. Here is how it worked. A parabolic antenna was mounted beneath the bomber's fuselage, inside a protective dome. This antenna rotated continuously, sweeping a full 360 degrees. With each rotation, the magnetron fired pulses of microwave energy toward the ground. Those pulses struck the earth and bounced back. The time delay between transmission and return told the system how far away each surface was. The strength of the return told the system what type of surface it was. Water, lakes, rivers, the sea reflected almost nothing. It appeared black on the display. Farmland gave a moderate return, showing as grey, but urban areas blazed with light. The thousands of vertical surfaces in a city, walls, chimneys, factory buildings, warehouses, all acted as efficient reflectors. On the navigator's screen, a city appeared as a bright concentration against the darker countryside around it. The display was called a plan position indicator. It showed the navigator a view of the Earth as if seen from directly above, a radar map that updated with each sweep of the antenna. Rivers appeared as dark, winding lines. Coastlines were unmistakable boundaries between the blackness of water and the texture of land. And cities announced themselves clearly, even through total cloud cover, even in the darkest night. Blumlein's contributions were essential. He invented the line-type pulse modulator, a circuit that allowed the magnetron to fire reliable high-power pulses without destroying itself. This invention was so fundamental that it is still used in radar systems today, more than 80 years later. He developed what became known as the Blumlein line, a transmission circuit that solved a critical voltage problem in pulse generation. He integrated the magnetron, the antenna, the receiver, and the display into a system that actually worked inside a vibrating, freezing, unpressurized aircraft fuselage. The project had a curious name. Officially, H2S stood for Home Sweet Home, a comforting phrase that supposedly referred to helping bombers find their way back. But the real story was rather different. When Lord Churchill, Winston Churchill's scientific advisor, visited the laboratory and saw the early equipment, he was skeptical that it could actually produce images of the ground. After a demonstration that failed to impress him, Churchill reportedly declared that the whole thing stinks. Due to a miscommunication, the engineers believed Churchill had cancelled the project. When he returned later and discovered work had stopped, he angrily demanded it resume, and again said it stinks. The engineers decided to name the project after his reaction. H2S is the chemical formula for hydrogen sulfide, the compound responsible for the smell of rotten eggs. When Churchill eventually asked what the name meant, nobody had the courage to tell him the truth. Someone invented Home Sweet Home on the spot. Churchill believed it and repeated the explanation to others. The cover story became official history. By June 1942, after months of exhausting work, the system was finally ready for demonstration. Test flights had shown remarkable results. Cities were clearly visible at ranges of 40 kilometers or more. Bernard Lovell himself had flown in the test aircraft and watched Gloucester and Cheltenham appear on the screen exactly where they should be. It was time to show the production team what their creation could do. Alan Blumlein was scheduled to be on board. On the evening of Saturday, the 6th of June 1942, Bernard Lovell climbed aboard Halifax Bomber 5 9977 at RAF Defford. The aircraft carried the latest prototype of the H2S radar system. Lovell wanted to see for himself what the equipment could do. The flight was extraordinary. As the Halifax cruised over the English countryside, the radar screen came alive. Gloucester appeared, a bright cluster of returns against the darker farmland. Then Cheltenham. The cities were visible from 40 kilometers away, their shapes unmistakable on the display. The system worked. After months of grueling effort, the technology was performing exactly as intended. Lovell landed that evening, elated. The demonstration had exceeded all expectations. The following day was Sunday, the 7th of June. The EMI team, the engineers who had built the production version of the equipment, wanted to see the results for themselves. They had labored for months on circuits and components without ever witnessing the system in actual flight. Now they would finally see their creation in action. Alan Blumlein was among them. He boarded Halifax 59977 alongside two of his EMI colleagues, Cecil Oswald Brown and Frank Blythen. The aircraft also carried RAF crew members and additional TRE personnel, 11 men in total. At 14:50, the Halifax lifted off from RAF Defford and climbed into the afternoon sky. The flight proceeded normally. The aircraft headed west over Gloucestershire, carrying out another demonstration of the H2S system. The weather was clear. There was no enemy action, no combat, no external threat of any kind. It was a routine test flight on a quiet Sunday afternoon in the English countryside. At 16:20, the Halifax was flying over the Forest of Dean at an altitude of approximately 500 feet. On the ground below, a farm worker named Onslow Kirby was working on the Courtfield estate. He heard the aircraft overhead and looked up. What he saw was horrifying. Fire was erupting from the starboard outer engine, the engine on the far right side of the aircraft. The flames were spreading rapidly along the wing. Within seconds, the fire had burned through the wing structure entirely. The starboard wing separated from the fuselage and fell away. The Halifax rolled and plummeted toward the ground. There was no time to recover, no time to bail out, no time for anything. The aircraft struck a field near the village of Welsh Bicknor in Herefordshire. The impact was catastrophic. All 11 men on board lost their lives instantly. Alan Blumlein was 38 years old. The RAF investigation, completed 3 weeks later, determined the cause. A recent Rolls-Royce service modification had required mechanics to adjust 48 lock nuts per engine, small fasteners that held the valve mechanisms in place. On the starboard outer engine, one of those nuts had not been properly tightened. During flight, it worked loose. The valve it secured broke off. Hot exhaust gases ignited the fuel-air mixture. The fire that resulted was beyond the crew's ability to control. The investigation also discovered something else. The fire extinguisher bottles, mounted in the engine nacelles, the safety system designed to suppress exactly this type of emergency, were empty. They had never been filled. 11 men perished because of a single loose nut and a set of empty fire extinguishers. That night, Bernard Lovell received a telephone call. A car was sent to collect him. He was driven through the darkness to the crash site near Welsh Bicknor, accompanied by Group Captain King. But Lovell had not come to mourn his colleagues. He had come on a mission. Somewhere in that wreckage lay the most secret piece of equipment in Britain, the Cavity Magnetron. If the Germans ever learned what that device could do, they could build their own. The advantage would be lost. Lovell searched through the charred debris in the darkness, stepping past the covered bodies of men he had worked beside just hours before. He found the magnetron among the wreckage. Its solid copper construction had survived the impact and the fire. The secret was safe. Years later, Lovell would write about that night. He said that he was still a young man in his 20s, accustomed to reading about the horrors of war, but not to first-hand acquaintance with colleagues lying lifeless under sheets near the charred remains of a bomber in which he himself had flown unconcerned just the previous evening. The greatest electronic engineer Britain had ever produced was gone, and the question on everyone's mind was simple. Could the project survive without him? Winston Churchill received the news of the crash within hours. His reaction was immediate and absolute. Everything about this incident was to be classified. No press releases, no public announcements, no explanation of any kind. The Prime Minister understood what was at stake. If the Germans learned that a secret radar project had just lost its chief engineer and several key scientists, they would know that Britain was developing something important. They would intensify their efforts to discover what it was. They might even suspect, correctly, that the wreckage contained technology worth investigating. Churchill could not allow Hitler that satisfaction. The families of the 11 men received only the barest information. There had been an accident. Their loved ones had not survived. The details were classified. No further questions could be answered. Doreen Blumlein was told almost nothing about how her husband had perished. She was not told about the loose nut. She was not told about the empty fire extinguishers. She was not told what her husband had been working on or why it mattered. For years afterwards, she believed that German sabotage might have been responsible. It was easier to imagine enemy action than to accept that a preventable maintenance failure had taken Alan from her. The name Alan Blumlein did not appear in any British newspaper for nearly 3 years. The man who had invented stereo sound, who had helped create British television, who had designed the radar system that would soon devastate German cities. This man simply vanished from public record. His colleagues could not speak of him. His contributions could not be acknowledged. His family could not properly explain what he had done or why he had been on that aircraft. At TRE and EMI, the mood was bleak. Blumlein had been the technical center of the H2S project. His understanding of electronics was so deep, his ability to solve problems so extraordinary, that many believed the entire effort would collapse without him. The magnetron had survived the crash, but could the project survive the loss of its architect? Some engineers privately doubted it. Blumlein had carried so much knowledge in his head, solutions to problems that had never been written down, approaches that only he fully understood. How could anyone replace a mind like that? The Secretary of State for Air called the crash a national disaster. He was not exaggerating. Britain had lost one of its most valuable scientific assets at a critical moment in the war, but the engineers who had worked beside Blumlein were not willing to let his work perish with him. They had learned from him. They had absorbed his methods. They had watched him solve impossible problems and had understood, at least partially, how he did it. The project would continue, and it would succeed. Within days of the crash, Winston Churchill summoned Bernard Lovell to London. The young physicist expected to deliver a grim progress report. Instead, he received new orders. The Prime Minister made himself absolutely clear. The H2S project was to continue at full speed. Churchill demanded 200 complete sets by October 1942. The priority status remained unchanged. If anything, the loss of Blumlein made the work more urgent. His sacrifice could not be allowed to mean nothing. Lovell returned to the team with Churchill's mandate. The engineers who had worked beside Blumlein threw themselves into completing what he had started. EMI managed to produce 50 sets. TRE manufactured another 150 in-house. It was a brutal schedule, but they met it. On the night of the 30th to 31st of January 1943, H2S went to war. 13 Pathfinder aircraft, Stirlings from No. 7 Squadron and Halifaxes from No. 35 Squadron, took off from their bases in England. Each aircraft carried an operational H2S set. Their mission was to find Hamburg and mark it with coloured flares for the main bomber force following behind. Approximately 100 Lancasters followed the Pathfinders. They would drop their bombs on the markers. But for the first time in history, those markers would be placed using radar, not visual navigation, not dead reckoning, not luck. The navigators in the Pathfinder aircraft watched their screens as the German coastline appeared, then the distinctive shape of the River Elbe, then the bright concentration of returns that could only be Hamburg. It was the first combat use of ground mapping radar anywhere in the world. The technology Alan Blumlein had given his life for was finally being used against the enemy. But the fears that had haunted the project from the beginning came true almost immediately. On the second operational mission, a raid on Cologne on the night of the 2nd to 3rd of February, a Stirling bomber carrying H2S was shot down near Rotterdam. The aircraft crashed in occupied territory, and unlike the Halifax that had carried Blumlein to his end, this wreckage fell into German hands. The Germans recovered an almost complete H2S set. They transported it to Berlin and assembled it on top of the Humboldtine Flak Tower, one of the massive concrete fortresses that defended the capital. When they powered it on and saw clear radar images of the city below, the reaction was immediate. According to reports, near panic broke out in the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring himself was considerably shaken by what the device could do. The British had always known this might happen. Before H2S was ever deployed, there had been fierce debate about the risk. Lord Cherwell and others had argued that using the system over enemy territory was too dangerous. If the Germans captured a magnetron, they could reverse engineer it and build their own centimetric radar. The advantage would be lost. But the H2S team had made a counter-argument. Yes, the Germans might capture the equipment. Yes, they would understand what it did. But understanding a technology and manufacturing it are two very different things. The Cavity Magnetron required precision engineering and specialized materials. It had taken British scientists years to develop. The Germans would need time, perhaps years, to catch up. The counter-argument proved correct. Despite having a complete H2S set in their possession, the Germans required more than 2 years to develop their own magnetron-based radar. Their version, the Fuji 240 Berlin, did not reach production until April 1945. By then, the war was already lost. The captured equipment had come too late to save the Reich. Meanwhile, H2S was transforming the bombing campaign. On the night of the 27th to 28th of July, 1943, Bomber Command launched Operation Gomorrah, a series of devastating raids against Hamburg. The Pathfinder aircraft used H2S to navigate through darkness and cloud cover to their target. The radar worked perfectly over Hamburg. The coastline and the River Elbe provided unmistakable contrast on the screens. The navigators knew exactly where they were. What followed was one of the most destructive events of the entire war. The combination of high explosive bombs and incendiaries created a firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno that generated winds of over 200 kilometers per hour. The temperatures at the center reached 800 degrees. The fire consumed everything. Between 30 and 45,000 people perished in a single night. 16,000 apartment buildings were destroyed. Over 1,200,000 residents, 2/3 of Hamburg's population, fled the city in the days that followed. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later wrote that if similar attacks had immediately followed on 6 more German cities, the war might have ended then and there. H2S had made it possible. Without Blumlein's radar, the bombers could never have found their target with such precision on a cloudy night. Without the Cavity Magnetron, there would have been no H2S. Without the sacrifice of those 11 men over Welsh Bicknor, the technology might have been delayed by months or years. Alan Blumlein never saw Hamburg burn. He never saw the system he built guide thousands of aircraft to their targets. He never knew that his invention would remain in service for the next 50 years. From Hamburg in 1943 to Victor tankers in 1993, with Avro Vulcans still using H2S during the Falklands War in 1982. But his legacy was measured in fire and victory. The system Alan Blumlein created outlived him by half a century. H2S remained in operational service from Hamburg in 1943 to the Falklands War in 1982, when Avro Vulcans carried the Mark 9 version. The final sets were retired in 1993 with the last Victor tankers. 50 years of continuous use. But H2S was only part of the story. The line-type pulse modulator Blumlein invented is still used in radar systems today, more than 80 years later. During his 15-year career, Alan Blumlein filed 128 patents, 1 patent every 6 weeks. Not applications, granted patents for problems no one else had solved. The range was extraordinary. His loading coils eliminated crosstalk on telephone lines and remained in use until the end of the analog era. His stereo patent defined audio recording for generations. His circuits made the BBC's first television broadcasts possible. His radar work burned German cities. In 1936, he patented the long-tailed pair differential amplifier. That circuit is now inside virtually every operational amplifier manufactured today. Billions of devices. One man's idea. So why has almost no one heard of him? Wartime secrecy meant his radar work stayed classified for years. By then, other names had filled the histories. Unlike many inventors, Blumlein never sought publicity. He did not give lectures or interviews. He solved problems instead of talking about them, and only 4 photographs of him are known to exist. In an age of media, he became invisible. Recognition came late, 1977. A blue plaque on his Ealing home, 35 years after his passing. 2008, the Alan Blumlein building at RAF Defford, opened by Princess Anne. 2015, an IEEE milestone at Abbey Road Studios. 2017, a Technical Grammy Award. 75 years. That is how long the music industry took to formally acknowledge the man who invented stereo sound. On the 9th of June 2019, a small group gathered in a quiet field near Welsh Bicknor. 77 years had passed since Halifax CFM 9977 fell from the sky at this exact spot. A memorial stone was finally being unveiled. 11 families attended, 1 for each man who had been lost. Among them was Judy Spence, the daughter of Bernard Lovell. Her father had driven to this same field in the darkness of June 1942, searching through wreckage and bodies for a secret device that could not fall into enemy hands. Now his daughter stood in sunlight, honoring the men he had left behind that night. Alan Blumlein never saw what his invention accomplished. He never saw H2S guide pathfinders over Hamburg. He never saw the firestorm that broke German morale. He never saw D-Day when bombers flew through solid cloud cover and struck their targets with precision that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. He never heard stereo become the worldwide standard. He never knew that his 45-45 system would be adopted in 1958 and remained dominant for the rest of the century. He never put on a pair of headphones and heard music the way billions of people hear it today. Left channel, right channel, sound that follows the source. He was 38 years old. He was testing the system that would change the war, and then he was gone. One historian wrote that without Blumlein, the Second World War might have ended differently. It is impossible to prove, but it is equally impossible to ignore what his work achieved. The radar that found cities in darkness, the bombers that finally hit their targets, the technology that served for 50 years. Every time you listen to music through headphones, you are using his invention. Every time a radar system fires a pulse, it may be using his modulator design. His fingerprints are everywhere, invisible, unacknowledged, essential. Hitler mounted a massive effort to discover British radar secrets. German intelligence searched for the scientists behind the technology that was devastating their cities. They never found Alan Blumlein. They never learned his name, and now you know it.